Hello, in this video, we're going to take a look at the Java FX Scene Builder application, and we're going to use it to create a graphical user interface. A lot of times folks call these GUIs. Basically, a GUI allows us to interact with our users in a more interactive way than we have so far. So far, we've just been using the command line interface, but this is going to let us have access to fields and buttons that we can display for the user to interact with us. So prior to walking through this video with me, you want to make sure that you've installed Scene Builder. And I do have directions, if you're in the Advanced Java class, located in the Materials folder for how to install Scene Builder. It's a pretty quick and easy install. But why we would like to use Scene Builder is basically it allows us to create a GUI, a graphical user interface, using drag and drop. Okay, so we're going to drag and drop different features onto a window and basically create a layout without typing any code. And we're going to be able to edit the layout, preview it. We can even use cascading style sheets to change the look and feel of the app. But that's a bit beyond us right now, but that is something that you can do. So Scene Builder creates this layout, and it's not a Java file. We are going to use it with our Java projects, but it's actually a file extension fxml file. So fxml stands for FX markup language, and it uses XML markup language to describe a layout. So basically, when you drag and drop items onto the screen, such as those that you see before us here, this is an example used in the chapter called the tip calculator. When you drag and drop, for example, this typeable amount field onto the window, it generates the fxml markup. So if you've ever used a IDE like Android Studio or Visual Studio for creating Windows apps, you may have used a similar type of tool where you can drag and drop to generate your layout. So the good news is you don't need to know XML to generate the code. So taking a look at the slide in front of us, some terms that we want to be familiar with is the stage. So we're looking at a running application, so the window is known as the stage. It's an instance of class stage, part of the Java FX package. We'll see that when we get to the Java part of all of this, which is not going to be done in Scene Builder. Scene Builder works on our layout, our fxml file. Next week, we're going to take a look at the Java pieces that go with it. The reason why we're talking about packages is that, as I said, Java will provide the backend logic for this layout. So, for example, the tip calculator takes an amount as well as a tip input. That's the second one here. How much do we want to tip? User clicks calculate, and then the fields below there, the tip and the total, will display the calculated tip and total. So the smarts behind that, the logic for the calculate, will be written in Java code. So we're going to see the two pieces come together, the Java backend code and the layout, and we'll see them working together next week. So stage basically contains one active scene, and that a scene defines what's called a scene graph, which is a tree data structure of visual elements. So that's a fancy way of saying we have lots of what are called nodes on our screen, and nodes are really just visual pieces of interest that we can look at and interact with. So our calculate button is a node, for example. But you're also going to hear the term controls or widgets, and where node is a more generic term that refers to anything visual on the screen. Controls are a little more specific, and we use that term when we're talking about the labels here that label our fields, the input fields, which are actually called text fields, the slider. These things that interact with the user, or the labels, we typically call those controls. So interestingly enough, nodes, again, those are just anything on the screen, can also have children, and typically if that's the case, they're containers. that can have child nodes. So you can nest these items inside each other. So let's switch gears and go to Scene Builder. Now, when you first open Scene Builder, you may get a recent projects pop up. I'm going to X out of that and go directly to Scene Builder. And we have a new project. It's actually untitled right now. So if I go to File, Save As, I could call it, Hello World or Hello Java. Looks like I actually have one of each already. So I'll just call it Hello. But notice the file extension, fxml. Okay, so I'm going to hit save. Now you can see that file name up there at the top. On the left, what we have is a series of menus that provide things that we can add to our application. So containers is a good place to start. That is typically what is the root node. We're going to use one called VBox. And VBox, if we either double click it or drag and drop to the center displays what we have in our layout so far. So right now we just have an empty box, but it's going to serve as the container for which we can add other things. And if you'll notice down here at the bottom in the hierarchy section under document, we now have something. We have VBox, that's our root. And you'll notice as we add things, so for example, if I come over here and I add, let's go under controls. We don't want a container anymore. I want a label. I can either double click or drag and drop it over here. We're going to work on that alignment in just a moment. The label shows up inside of the VBox, so it's a child node. So you can see you can build this hierarchy of items inside of your layout. And then on the right-hand side, we have what's called the inspector window, which shows us the properties of the selected node. So if I have label selected, which I do, you can see the little blue lines around here. Over here on the right, we're looking at the properties of that label. You can also, there's also a layout menu here where there's some things that have to do with padding and margin and that kind of thing. And we'll also see there's a code block which allows us to generate some IDs and other event handler type information we'll see a little bit later down the road that are going to make it easier for us to and make it possible for us to interact with these visual elements via the Java code. So again, that's kind of part 2. We'll see the Java code next time, but our inspector window allows us to set properties and so forth. Notice, by the way, sometimes it's a little difficult to grab the right items, so I'm going to go ahead. Let's say I want the properties of VBox. I can come over here to the hierarchy, select VBox, and then the inspector window changes. So inspector window is context sensitive based on whichever item is currently selected. So for example, if I want the VBox to center all of the items, I can come over here to the properties window and select center. And notice now my label is centered. Anything I would drag and drop onto this this window then would be centered, such as an image view. I could drag and drop. An image view just allows you to add an image. It's a container for an image to display in your application. And once you add one, you could come over here to your properties window and select the actual image that you want to add to your application. I think I have one here. It's actually used in an Android class. So we have an image here. And so, we can click on the label to see the properties for label. We can click on the image view to see the properties for the image view. If at any point we want to delete them, we can select the item you want to delete and hit delete, or you can come over here to your hierarchy and select it from here and delete. Let's put a little text in that label. By the way, if you double click the label, there we go. You can actually type in it to edit the text, Or you can come over here to the properties window and edit it from there. In the properties window, you can also do more fun things like, change the color. My favorite color is purple. Put some purple in there. As our text, we can change the size, of the text to make it larger and so forth. So you can play around. There's a lot of different things here. You can see we can also toggle visibility if we want it to be initially hidden and then we show it later with Java code, that kind of thing. So there's lots of different properties that you can play around with here. The default size of a VBox is actually 450 by 300. So that is something else that you can change, is the size of this guy here. Let's go under. Oops, I apologize. I think I said 450. It's actually 600 by 400. So you can edit those to change the size of your VBox. Oops, let's change that one there. So you can, experiment with these different properties, okay? So remember, if you save, we did this at the beginning, if you save, you're actually saving an fxml file. So let's actually create a tip calculator app. So let me review. I'm going to pull up the slide here. Take a look at what that application looks like. Oops, not having luck with my mouse. There we go. There we are. Okay. So the tip calculator, as I said, it allows the user to type in a bill amount and move the slider thumb to change the tip percentage. And then press calculate and it will provide a tip and a total. So here we see it with some sample values in there. If the user would slide the thumb on the slider up to 20%, we would see that reflected in the calculated tip and total. So what we're looking at on this slide here is the way that this particular layout is constructed is by using a grid pane. So a grid pane, unlike VBox, it's also a container, but unlike VBox, which is just basically a box, a grid pane organizes the layout into rows and columns. So this slide really shows how the columns and rows will be selected. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to switch gears, go back to, we don't really need hello anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. And we will save this one as tip calculator. If I have one, it looks like I do. May have to create a second. We'll go ahead and replace what's there. Okay, that works for me. So what we're going to do is we are going to take that container, that grid pane. You can either double click again or drag and drop, and you can see we have that basic structure, but we need a few more rows. So if you select the last row and you right click, you can add a row below to get a few more rows in there. And if we needed to add columns, we could do the same, but we're okay on the number of columns. So if you looked at that last slide, we had labels, text fields, sliders, and a button that we needed. So we're going to add those labels now to the left-hand side. Again, those are under controls. Oops, sorry, under controls. Let's find our label. There we go. So we're going to add some labels here and change the text of them. We're also going to add a button. A slider that's basically going to allow us to select the tip amount, tip percentage rather, and sorry, I'm looking here for what we want, our text field. Okay, so that's where they're going to enter in the amount and also where we're going to display the calculated tip and the calculated total. So you can see we can drag these various things around. Let's go ahead and edit those labels, by the way. The labels are amount. We can edit in the window here. This one is, we're going to say 15%. Now that is a default value. We will programmatically change that later as the user slides. So we'll have an event handler for the slider that handles the slide event. It's something we're going to talk a lot more about. And down here, our total. Okay. So that gets us going. We have some labels now. We have some controls. Notice, by the way, the column numbering starts at 0. So the first column is 0. The second column is 1. The first row is 0. The second row is 1. So that's just something to bear in mind when they say things in the book, such as add a slider to the first row 1, column 1. That would actually be this cell because it is in column 1 and row 1. So Scene Builder auto sets the layout of a grid to be 600 by 400, but we'd like the size to adjust based on the contents. So you can do that. I'm going to select the grid in the hierarchy. I could also do it here. It's just a little easier sometimes to select items via the hierarchy because I can really click exactly on what I want. Oops, and there we go. Clicked off of it for a second. Then I can come over here and I can say preferred width. I can edit this. Right now it is 600 by 400, but we're going to say use computed size, and that will make it basically use what it needs. Okay. It'd also be nice to right align these columns so that the column names, the label names align exactly right beside the fields for which they describe. So we can select the column, and each alignment here on the properties window we can say right, and that will right align us. So you can experiment with some of these different things. We can also say, well, that button down there, let's go ahead and make that button. I'm going to go up to properties and change the text while we're here to calculate. We can say, well, we want the width of this to match the column. So that's something we can do by looking at the layout and going to the max width. Where are you? There we go. Instead of use computed, we can say max value. That'll stretch it to be the size of the column. So one of the things that we haven't done yet is to add IDs to these various input values. Okay, so we have an input amount, we have an input tip. We also have items that we're going to need to access and code so that we can display a calculated tip and total. Okay, also in code later on, we'll need to access this label 15% by the slider because we'll need to be able to update it based on the value selected. So these various items, we're kind of thinking ahead and saying, well, in the Java code, we're going to need to either get or set their values. So we need to have, think of it as a handle for us to be able to refer to them in code, and that's really the ID. So picking on that 15% there, I'm going to select it and then go to code. In this code block, I can attach an ID to it, and that will allow us to access it in the Java code using this ID. So we're going to call this tip percentage label. And I'm just basically following with Deitel's book here of the various names that they are using. Amount text field. Our slider here, we want the ID to be tip percentage slider. Tip text field. And our total down here would be our total text field. Text fields are those box fields that generally we take input to, although in this case they're using the text field to basically display an output. So in a few steps from now we will adjust those so that the user can't type in those. But anyway, adding those IDs will allow us to refer to them in the Java code next week or later in this chapter as you move along with your reading. So another thing that we can do is preview from inside of this application. So we can go to preview, show preview in window, and then you can see what the application will look like. So right now, we have no space between the labels and the fields. They're kind of right up against one another. I'm not going to show you this, but it's in the textbook. You can tweak this a bit by adding margins and horizontal gaps to just basically kind of clean up the cosmetics here. It's actually step 8 in your textbook as it goes through some of the various steps. So that's a little bit of a more minor point, but one thing I do want to show is how to make tip and total, these second two things. See, right now the user can type in those, and that should not be the case. Those are calculated. So we're going to go ahead and edit those to make them uneditable and unfocused traversable. That's a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to select the first one here and go to Properties. And I'm going to uncheck Focus Traversable. That means that when the user is tabbing through, it's not on the path to be tabbed to. When they tab off of Amount, go down to Calculate. Or possibly, yes, that actually would go from Amount to Calculate. We're also going to not make it editable, so we'll uncheck that as well. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay, so that'll make it, let's try it again, preview. Tabbing takes me to calculate, that's a good sign. And I'm trying to type the number 5 in my tip and it is not working, that is good. So that's something else that you can do. You can make non-editable fields. Right now the slider's default goes from 0 to 100. But we really don't want 100% tip option. We'd like it to go from 0 to 30. And we would like the 15% to be the default. So we can do that. I'm going to select my slider here and go ahead and change a few things here. My max value will be 30. And my value will be 15 because I'm initially going to set it to 15. And the block increment will be 5. And that means when the user moves the thumb on the slider that it's going to go up by 5, an increment of 5. Okay. Now, it is actually functioning correctly. It looks a bit strange though because we still see that 15%, and that's going to be handled with the Java code. So that's actually working as designed right now. So I'm not too worried about that. Next week, we're also going to take a look at how to specify the logic on the button. That's called an event handler. So remember that this layout is going to be part of a Java project, and there will be a class called a controller class that defines instance variables and allows us to interact with our controls programmatically. as well as have events. So for instance, if the user clicks a button, something happens. So along with this particular layout, we're going to see a corresponding Java file, and it's going to be called a controller. So for us, it'll be called the tip calculator controller. So we need to specify what the name of that class file is going to be. So if I select over here under my document itself, and I go to controller, I'm going to specify the controller class as tip calculator controller. So that will help us out. That's going to, we'll see in a moment, we are actually going to be able to use this tool to kind of get us a skeleton of the class, to get us going on the Java work. The other thing we need to do is when the user clicks the button, we want to calculate the tip. So we need to have an event handler for the button click. So I'm going to select my button here. And over here on the right, I'm going to close the properties and go to code. I am going to find, there is a particular place that is called on action. The on action specifies what method should be called when that button is clicked. So we want calculate button pressed, a method that doesn't exist yet, okay, but we want to create it in Java code so that it can handle the button click. Okay, so by adding that there, you'll see the benefit of it momentarily. So let's take a peek at our preview. Our preview, those last few changes actually shouldn't have changed anything from the user's perspective, but everything's looking pretty good. We can type in here. We can move our slider. We can press calculate, but of course nothing happens yet. So our next steps will be to create the Java code to establish the logic for this particular layout. Now we can get a head start by using Scene Builder to generate an initial controller class for us. It's called a controller skeleton. So if we go to View, there is a Show Sample Controller Skeleton, and we can actually copy this code and put it into a Java class file called tip calculator controller, and it's going to automatically import the correct FXML classes that we need. And it also generated instance variables for this particular class. It basically went through and everything we added an ID for, it generated a corresponding instance variable. So we'll be able to interact with, for example, the amount text field because we have access to it here as a instance variable, okay? We also down here at the bottom have calculate button pressed, which is a event handler. That method will be used to handle the calculate so that when they hit calculate, we can put code in there to handle that event and do something. So for us, we'll be calculating and then, you know, pushing back some information to the user. What was the calculated tip and what was the calculated total? And that'll be on part 2. We'll take a look at that next week. But it is part of this chapter, so you can keep going with this and move on to the next piece.